It's not that difficult. I mean, it's partly around the people you choose for the roles. I mean, if you're bringing in people that have a strong external mindset, they will just naturally gravitate towards that. The challenge is to make sure that they've got enough space in their day to spend time on the outside world. You know, what I've observed, the times that people get frustrated is normally when they feel they're spending too much time on internal stuff and not enough time being out in the market, talking to people they could be potentially working with externally or stakeholders or customers. Because what you don't want to get into is micromanaging people. Right. So you'll give them the space to do their thing. But I judge it a bit by, in the sort of conversations we have, how much of the time we're talking about, external stuff and this is a customer opportunity and here's a new market we could go for, versus how much we're talking about, we had this audit and it's all bad and we've got to do something about it, or sort of internal process. So you can judge, the mood of the organization pretty well from the day-to-day conversations that you have. I try and avoid making it a big intervention, because what you don't want to do is layer on another initiative. Otherwise you become very initiative heavy as a team, and you really want to be sort of driven by market opportunity and try and keep process and initiatives as light as possible.
That's Mark Gainsborough, Executive Vice President of New Energies at Shell. I'm Alison Eyring, Organization Psychologist, CEO, and Endurance Athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special type of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow and still keeping their people energized. Growth Leaders is my new podcast where I'll show you what it takes to successfully lead business growth in conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. Welcome, Mark, and thanks for joining me on Growth Leaders.
Great to be on your podcast, Alison. Looking forward to it.
Mark, tell me a little bit about your first job. What was it? What was not the after college kind of nice, I've got a degree, but what was the very first job you ever had?
Well, the very, very first job I ever had was actually as a paper boy, but I don't want to go there. I did then graduate onto being a pump jockey on a gasoline station a few years later. But my first real job after I joined Shell, of course, was selling fuels and lubricants to commercial customers in the UK.
Well, you and I then have that in common, because my first job was at 11 delivering newspapers.
Fantastic.
I used to make the dogs happy at Christmas time. Mm-hmm. I would give them dog bones.
That was the time when you get big tips at Christmas.
Exactly. Your job now is heading up Shell's New Energies business. Is that right?
Absolutely. And of course, it's great to be in a real, true, full-on growth business, because that's what it is. We're starting from a very small base in New Energies, but with big aspirations to grow in a number of the businesses that we're looking at. I'm finding the challenges are completely different. In the last couple of jobs I had in Shell, I was really running much more established businesses. And although they had a growth dimension, when you've got something that's 90% a growth business, you have to really bring a different mindset to play. If you try and do things the same way you did as a steady state business leader, you frankly don't grow very fast. So that's the challenge, is to start to operate in a different way.
Give me an example of that. What's something that seems very different to you?
Well, good example. We've set up a few digital ventures where you're starting with a completely new business model, and the usual metrics around sort of cash flow and profit and loss for the first few years of the ventures, they really don't apply. You've got to suspend judgment and be prepared to invest up front. A lot of the drive in the early years for those sort of ventures is around revenue growth, because most of the businesses trade on a multiple of revenues. Now, those of us who have been around for a while, we're used to trading on a multiple of EBITDA. It's what's the bottom line. Here, there's a lot more emphasis on top line, growing top line fast enough, building scale, and then if you've done your job well, you'll have a revenue model where profitability will follow once you've had that revenue growth.
I think that's really interesting, because if I remember in our growth research, we found that the growth leaders tended to they would use more metrics, and they were more non-traditional. And you're giving a great example of how you got to make sure you're using the right metrics.
Yeah, because if you try and use a very sort of traditional metric that works for an established business, it may actually kill off the venture at quite an early stage. Now, there is an element, when you're a growth leader, I think one of the other things you've got to do is you've got to be prepared to be a bit more experimental, but equally you've got to be prepared to fail a bit faster. So if you're a steady state leader, typically when things go badly wrong, it's long and expensive, the pathway to to a business going under. But you're taking, in the growth business, you probably have to take more experimental bets, and you say, and if they're not working out, then you've got to be prepared to either pivot quickly to something else or to allow the thing to fail. What we're trying to do is encourage a little bit more of a sort of startup mindset, where people, they know they've got to perform against short-term milestones. You don't give them the traditional annual funding round. Basically, some of the ventures we have, I've given them a couple of months and said, okay, show me the next milestones, and if you meet those, we'll carry on. Otherwise, you're out of business. And that's been quite an interesting way of working.
The people that you're working with, are they coming from the same organization, from the shell organization? Now they're in the new startup, or have you hired them from the outside?
No, it's a mix. Some of our businesses I'm looking after new energy is a bit more traditional. They look a bit more like an oil and gas project. If you're building a big offshore wind farm, you need a lot of similar skills. The amount of capital invested is huge. You've got to have very, very good disciplines. So that's a growth business that is more like a traditional oil and gas type of growth business. And a lot of oil and gas people are working in it. But on the other hand, if you're running something which is a digital venture based around new business models, you tend to bring in people from the outside. I would say 80% of the people in our digital ventures are external hires who come in with a digital business background, for example.
So what would you say, as a leader, what's your greatest challenge in getting these different kinds of people working together?
It's partly about people at least having a sort of shared vocabulary and language, so you don't end up talking past each other all the time. Very often people come in because they come in with very different backgrounds and mindsets. It can be a problem. Sometimes you do get a cultural clash. There's a tension sometimes between the established processes that come with a big corporation like Shell and the desire of some of our new hires to go a lot faster and with less process. They're not, not everybody's used to working with the same constraints. It's good examples. We go through a lot of process in Shell before we put a non-binding offer in to, let's make a small acquisition. We go through quite a few hoops in Shell. A lot of people have come into the business from outside. They say, well, a non-binding offer, I can decide on that. It's only when I really want to make a binding offer, I have to go and seek some higher authority. So that's, one of the things that's an interesting tension. And a little bit the learning from, or the desire from a growth business like New Energies is try and bring in some of that freshness and lighter process into the rest of the company. Because I think a lot of our established businesses could do a lot better if we had less process around.
I love that. It connects a lot with the idea that I talk about in Pacing for Growth, about that the right pace wins the race. And sometimes people think it means about going slower, but sometimes it means you go faster, sometimes you need to go slower. And I think you're giving a good example of how some parts of the organization some people have to go slower because they have to be able to fit within the organization. At the same time, you're trying to get the broader organization to go faster.
Yeah.
So that's tough.
The life cycle, the lead time on different businesses, different. If you're doing a big renewables power generation project, it could be a several-year lifetime. If you're doing a different type of venture, or you're working in a startup, your cycle time is just very, very short, and in the sort of days and weeks. And I think that's okay. You've got to know which business you're in and be prepared to adapt the pace of growth to suit that. And some of the things that in the past, in my experience, trying to grow things, some of the things that didn't go well was when we just misjudged it in terms of the pace of growth of the market. A few years ago, I was looking after some of our work to try and get liquefied natural gas used more as a transport fuel, and now that's going pretty well. But a few years ago, we had things didn't work out well because we banked on the market for LNG and heavy-duty trucks growing quite fast. We got into some early-stage investments to promote that, and then we found that the truck manufacturers just didn't deliver the trucks. So I was left with no way to grow the business. Now, well, the team did very successfully. They pivoted away from heavy-duty trucking into marine, and now for marine markets, it looks like LNG is going to be a really important fuel for the future.
And I think that's actually a really great example of when we think about speed, it's not just about how fast we can go, but how fast can the business and even the ecosystem go.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're looking now that I think you've always got a question about whether are you sort of aspiring to grow with the market, or are you going to be a bit even bolder and try and create the market? So you're going to be a real early adopter. You see that at the moment. Of course, it's quite interesting in things like EV charging. So everybody's excited about electric vehicles and everybody's got tons of models coming out. There's a belief that growth is going to happen. And if you think about the infrastructure that's needed to provide for that, you do see it's a bit of a land grab at the moment. People want to get their charge posts into key locations, far ahead of it being commercially viable. So I think we're going to see some early players. It's a classic market where there'll be consolidation later on as everybody's scrambling and trying to build a position. Not everybody will get to scale. And those that have got good locations early on probably will be the ones that do well over time. But again, it also depends on how fast does that EV market grow. If it takes too long, then you're sitting there with lots of infrastructure not really being used very much for the next few years.
So it's a good example also of where you can leverage your existing assets of the traditional business in order to be able to grow the new business.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we think EV charging as business Shell should play in. It's got great adjacency to our existing fueling infrastructure. We like to be able to meet a wider range of customers' needs. So the customer that wants gasoline for their internal combustion engine and they've got an EV as well, we'd like to find a way to meet both of those needs.
Let me switch gears and just ask you a little bit about how you think about growth leadership. Now, do you think of yourself as a growth leader?
I certainly think of myself as a growth leader at the current time because it's a growth business. We've been growing, hiring quite a few people in. We're deploying more resources into space. All of our projects are basically growth projects. So you've got to be a growth leader, and you're thinking about growth not only in terms of sort of scale, but also how do I grow value? So there's got to be a strong value lens for where do I create more value for the company going forwards. In that sense, so leadership's a bit situational because if you're a steward of a more steady state business, there's only a certain amount of your mental space you can allocate towards thinking about growth. I think when you're a leader in a growth business, then 90% of what you do goes into thinking about, now, how do I grow this business? Which are the market segments? What are the business models? What are the resources that I need to grow? Getting the resources piece right is really difficult. Some businesses struggle because you just don't allocate enough resource to growth. One of the things that I can see very clearly is growth is very resource intensive. If you're not prepared to put the money and the people in, you're not going to be successful, particularly in a high growth market. You've got to do some element of sort of pre-investment early on, get some people on the ground, developing, originating projects. If it's a technology play, clearly you've got to think about the right R&D investment going into it as well. So, that's the essence of growth, is having a good sense of what level of resource you need to have. As a lot of startup companies find, if you get it wrong and you actually go too hard, too fast, you just run out of cash. If you're working in a sort of larger corporation like Shell, the challenge running growth business is not to feel like there's an endless supply of money available, because of course it's a different story. Funding new businesses in a company like Shell is different to being a true startup. So,
right.
So one of the things we're grappling with is how to maintain that sort of startup mindset of saying, okay, I want to be really measured about how much money I'm putting against the growth of the business. What are the milestones? Back to some metrics, having some sort of clear milestones for delivery in the business are really important. Even if it's a business that's in a kind of pre-P&L positive phase, you've still got to have your revenue targets, your number of customers, cost per customer acquisition, all of those sort of things.
You're reminding me of my first rule of intelligent restraint, which is focus overrules vision. And I love to tell the story that when you're doing an endurance race, vision will get you to the starting line, but it's focus that gets you across the finish line. As a growth leader, it sounds like you've got to be really good at driving focus and alignment, and then that ensures that you have the resources where you need them.
Absolutely. For sure you need to have focus. We work a lot now with early stage companies. We have our Shell Ventures group that does a lot of early stage investment. And of course, a lot of the startup companies, they start off with a vision, but then they bring tremendous focus to that one thing that they're working on. When you're a growth leader looking across multiple opportunities, you've got to be careful that sometimes you don't get a bit too unfocused and you end up getting pulled in many directions. So I think that ability to combine the vision piece with focus is really is important. But I don't think you can have really one without the other, because otherwise, you've got to have, for us,
Exactly.
The vision around why do you want to grow in new energies is all based around the purpose of providing more and cleaner energy solutions, the belief that over time we need to reduce our net carbon footprint. And that's a very, very powerful purpose to have, which is backing up all of the many sort of different projects and initiatives one's doing.
So Mark, you've had a long and successful career at Shell, and before you ran this business, you had run businesses that were growing at a slower rate. What was it that allowed you to shift gears this way? So you hadn't had this experience, and yet you've transitioned into a role which is now leading a very different kind of growth. To what do you attribute you making this transition?
Yeah, I think it's easy to forget, but if you've been working in oil and gas for as long as I have, which is over 30 years, of course, oil and gas in its own time was a high growth business. And some of the businesses I worked in the past were super high growing. I worked in the aviation business, jet fuel sales were booming, airlines were expanding rapidly. So I had plenty of experiences of being in growth businesses in the past, and that's sometimes it's easy to forget. People are now thinking, well, oil and gas isn't much of a growth business, but actually there's pretty steady growth for the next 20 years, to be honest. But it is different when you transition into some of the businesses which are more sort of hyper growth business opportunities. And I just think it's it's a sort of all round sort of business experience you get over a long career. And, of course, you see people you work with, you've got some people, they're really great as sort of stewards of the ship, and they're great if you need a cost-cutting program implemented, they know how to do that. And, many established businesses, you've got to have constant, continuous improvement is really critical. But then you see other examples of people that come in and can really shake things up, develop new businesses. One of the things that I think, is important in a growth leader, if you're doing very fast growth, to be honest, in a lot of the things that we look at and other industries, you'll see the same happening. There's usually quite a bit of inorganic growth. So you tend to see in the high growth businesses a lot of M&A and consolidation going on. So it does help if you've worked in that space before. So I had a few years working as the head of mergers and acquisitions for our downstream business in Shell. And that's been really useful because I found over the past couple of years, a lot of the growth opportunities we've looked at, it was easier to buy a stake in an existing platform rather than develop it organically ourselves, because we found we could accelerate the growth of a market position by about 3 years versus starting from ground zero by ourselves. So if you've got a market where you want to go fast, having some M&A capability is often really, really important, and that helps.
That's a tremendous insight. I think a lot of companies struggle with thinking about what are the experiences that leaders need that can enable them to be able to be growth leaders. You're also talking a little bit about one of the things that I think is important for a growth leader, and that is this ability to both drive the business to perform today, deliver results, and also to transform and build new capabilities for the future. But there's a third piece that I want to ask you about, and that third bit is to energize. And so one is you deliver today, you transform tomorrow, and then you energize people and teams. What do you as a leader do to energize yourself and also to energize those around you?
Well, I think that one of the ways that you energize people as a leader, it's about how you connect with them, it's about talking to them, it's about spending time just being a great communicator, really. The more you talk and interact and communicate and get people aligned behind the purpose of the company, I think that the more successful the organization will be. Sharing, celebrating the successes is kind of important. Commiserating together over the things that don't go so well. So, that's the sort of, in a way, there's a sort of social side to business that we often forget. But, you've got to, create that sort of energy level in the team. And, of course, it's important to do the things that help you to maintain your energy.
Give me an example of that. Tell me an example of something you've done that really stands out in your mind and you think, wow, I'm really so glad that we celebrated in this way.
Because we've been growing the organisation quite fast over the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of extended leadership team meetings, getting people together, talking about some of the sort of successes, collectively. I just did an end of year, webcast for people, or a video, where you just sort of say, look, everybody, it was a great job. We did so many really interesting things this year and great things, fantastic progress. So, those are some of the things to do. I also like to try and get my team to interact as much as possible with the external world. So if we're having a team event, we usually bring in a lot of people from outside who bring the different thinking around, how does a Grab taxi work, or how does a startup work? So we have a lot of that type of external input and talking to us about all the funky stuff that's going on in the outside world.
Well, and that's a great example of driving outside-in thinking, which is what research shows is so important for growth. Can you give me another example of how you get your leaders to do that with theirs? Because you're leading leaders that lead leaders who lead leaders. And how do you make sure that everybody in the organization is thinking outside in?
Well, I think it's just you're trying to create a sort of culture. I mean, it doesn't really work if you just tell people all the time, please do this. You want people to have, enough intrinsic motivation to go out and do that. I mean, it's not that difficult. I mean, it's partly around the people you choose for the roles. I mean, if you're bringing in people that have a strong external mindset, they will just naturally gravitate towards that. The challenge is to make sure that they've got enough space in their day to spend time on the outside world. What I've observed, the times that people get frustrated is normally when they feel they're spending too much time on internal stuff and not enough time being out in the market, talking to people they could be potentially working with externally or stakeholders or customers.
That's a problem that I observe in many organizations. How do you as a leader ensure that your people are focused and spending time on what really matters to the business?
It's difficult to be absolutely sure of that, because what you don't want to get into is micromanaging people. So you'll give them the space to do their thing, but I judge it a bit by in the sort of conversations we have, how much of the time we're talking about external stuff and this is a customer opportunity and here's a new market we could go for, versus how much we're talking about we had this audit and it's all bad and we've got to do something about it, or sort of internal process. So you can judge the mood of the organization pretty well from the day-to-day conversations that you have. I try and avoid making it a big intervention, because what you don't want to do is layer on another initiative. Otherwise you become very initiative heavy as a team, and you really want to be sort of driven by market opportunity and try and keep process and initiatives as light as possible.
Right. So it comes back to a little bit about focus and letting the market priorities prioritize what the internal priorities are.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the things we talk about is how can we work more sort of customer back. So make sure that what we're doing is really anchored in serving some customer need or a customer friction where we can bring a solution that's going to make the customer's life better, and that's probably going to create value for us in the process.
Now, Mark, you have lived and worked all around the world. What advice would you give to growth leaders that might be for the first time in a global role? What advice would you give them about being a good growth leader?
I think the number one thing is, to spend time getting out, seeing the markets. Get as close to the customer as you can. Get as close to your people that are in the front line with the customer. So you can't afford to just listen to a few of your senior members of your team who are filtering it. You want to go out and hear it for yourself and experience it, and through the sort of osmosis pick up the vibes of what's going on. Personally, I enjoyed it a lot. Most of my career I was based in Europe, often doing global jobs. I found it was really helpful when I was based out in Singapore for a few years, because you're kind of in a center of a lot of growth markets. So feeling a bit closer to growth is great. And at the time we had a business that I was running that was growing very fast in China. So I spent quite a bit of time traveling to China to understand what was happening out there. So being close to growth markets is good, because you do. Sometimes if you spend a lot of time working in very mature markets, it's a mental shift to go from the level of ambition you had in the sort of steady growth market into now we've got to grow a lot faster. And you've got to be much more ambitious about setting targets for year-on-year sales growth. And you've got to be much more ambitious about how much resource you're prepared to put in to support that growth. So it's a mindset and experience thing here. So being able to experience firsthand growth markets does help you if you want to be a growth leader. Let's face it, some people don't really make the transition. You've got some people who are just, they come in as a CEO, they've been a great cost cutter and optimizer in a previous job, and then if the rules change and suddenly they're in growth mode, it doesn't always work out that well. So I think if people during the course of their career get a chance to experience both growth markets and steady state markets and businesses, then you've got all of the tools at the disposal.
Well, I think that's great. That reminds me of one of my biggest disasters racing was when I trained in flat, warm climate, and the race was in the mountains in Mongolia. You got to train for the right race.
You got to train for the right race.
Exactly.
So, and of course, if you've run in lots of different places, so you've trained in various places, so you can do a range of different things. But indeed, if you're too specialised in one area, then it doesn't always translate to a new opportunity.
I really love that. I think a lot about an abundance mindset when I think about growth, and I'm always reminded of how many ways we can think about abundance, whether it's abundance of talent, abundance of capabilities. And so you're making me thinking about all the different experiences that we can provide to people that can help them develop those muscles to be able to lead growth. And it sounds like they need a portfolio of experiences that's quite varied. that is in different kinds of markets and with different products and things that grow at different rates.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, it's interesting that you see quite a few growth companies around, and they go through a very sort of explosive growth. Then things become a bit more stable, and then again, a lot of the leadership have difficulty adapting to this new, more steady state world. Classic transition is going from being revenue growth into bottom line growth. A lot of companies stumble when they get into that transition. I was always a kind of generalist utility player, so that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I think being a good different styles of leadership, I think is an advantage in the long run.
Great, Mark. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Great, thanks, Alison.
Many thanks to Mark for joining me for this episode of Growth Leaders. I hope you've been enjoying listening to Growth Leaders. Next season, we'll have more fascinating guests, great insights, and practical advice for leading growth. I'm Alison Eyring. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think.